Hey, welcome back to Ask Matt. This week, we are going to be talking about remote work. If you don't know me, I'm Matt Stauffer, and one of the reasons I talk about remote work is that I am one of the partners at Titan, which is a 100% remote company. So let's take a look at the tweet real quick. Jonas Erlandson said, "How does it work to be a 100% remote company? Would love to hear about the pitfalls, isolation, and how you'd solve them." So thanks for asking, Jonas. So when we started Titan in 2011, Dan and I were in the same office. We met in a co-working space and we started working together. And when we had our first hire maybe always, but definitely most of the time, came into the office with us. Our second hire lived in Chicago, and he would come in time and time. He was a contractor. He'd come in at times, and he would not be in at times. And I'm pretty sure that the first remote thing that happened was he said, "Hey, I'm moving." We said, "Okay, cool, no big deal." Very soon after that, I moved away, although I think we may have hired one or two people remotely after that. So this is in 2011, so remote work was a thing. We didn't invent it, but it also wasn't nearly as common then as it is today. And so we, rather than kind of working with what other people had said about what remote work looked like, we just kind of encountered every new challenge and then just asked, how do we answer this challenge in a way that best lines up with our values? And often that would mean defining our values as we go. One of the things I've talked about often is the fact that we always try to come up with metrics that allow us to gauge any particular. So when we get a question, we say, well, how does this line up with these particular metrics? And not metrics, more like questions. I want to ask this question of this challenge and say, well, how, of each of the solutions, how does each of these solutions line up with this particular, I don't know what the best term for it is, but for example, I always give this example of how when we talk about healthcare, we would ask the question of which of these healthcare plans that we're considering best lines up with our values. We had to define which values would impact healthcare plans before we could really say it. And what we ended up saying was one of the metrics is which healthcare plan best serves the people who need healthcare help the most, who are in the most difficult situations. So that became a question or a metric or whatever we want to think about it. So we did the same thing for remote. We said, and for all the questions with starting the company, or how do we create the company that we want to work for? It was probably our first thing. And we also talked about work-life balance and stuff like that. So most of the time when we thought about remote, we would say, well, what would we want to be afforded as remote workers? And so one of the first things that we noticed very, very, very early on is that a lot of things from really rich and robust and healthy communities at companies comes from the interactions that happen in the day-to-day outside of specifically working on the same project together. And sometimes you are working on the same project because it is you and the other person chatting over the cubicle wall or whatever it is. But there's a lot of other interactions that happen outside of that space. We have interactions that happen in hallways and water coolers and for drinks after work and a coffee break and taking a walk and, being the first two people in the morning and talking a little bit before the rest of the company gets in, whatever other things there are there. And so we said, what would it look like for us as a remote company to create good and healthy spaces for those types of interactions to happen? So one of the things we started early is something that is currently called Cat Meetup. It's been called different things over time. And the idea is that once or twice a week, the whole company gets together and talks. At various times, it's shifted from talks about what you did this weekend to what are you planning to do for work this week to what's some new technical challenge or excitement that you're working around. So it's sometimes been more technical, sometimes more personal. But in general, we want to see face-to-face video chat, whole company, at least once a week. We used to do more frequent ones. I think we even did daily ones at some point, although I'm not 100% sure. It's been a while. And also at one point, we explored a tool that puts everybody in the whole company's webcam on a grid, and it takes a picture of them every 5 seconds. And then when you click on them, it instantly opens up a call to them. They don't have to answer; it just opens up a direct call, and you can basically mark yourselves away so that that functionality is not available. And so the idea there was how, again, can we create the fact that you see people in the office around you, kind of out of the corner of your eye, and then you could just say, hey, Sally, blah 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 blah. You don't have to call and say, call Sally because you're in the same office. And so trying to create those types of spaces. We also used, what did we use early on? We used, it was Flint Campfire, right? We used Basecamp's chat tool for the longest time. We switched to HipChat for a little bit, but obviously Slack is what everybody uses now, but we were one of the first adopters of Slack because it allows you to have a lot of these things that we want really integrated in a single shared space. And so being online in Slack is really kind of like presence in the office for us. And one of the things worth noting is that One of the leading thinkers about how to do remote work right now is Basecamp, and we love and respect Basecamp a lot, but we also disagree with them a lot. One of the biggest places we disagree with them is remote. And one of the things that we've noticed is that, or at least I've noticed, is that Basecamp's remote culture is very individual. It's very what's the word? Asynchronous. And Basecamp as a product is very asynchronous. It is all about the person doing their work and putting notes in, and then another person doing their work and reading notes and putting notes in. It's very little about overlap in time, and that's something they really value. They believe in a remote work context in which part of remote work is the flexibility to work when works best for you. And that's something that, while the ideal of that sounds really nice, practically we've found that pair programming, and we're a consultancy, not a product team, so we also have the timelines of our customers to think about in a way that a product team doesn't. But also we really like collaboration and synchronicity. We want to be working at the same time, thinking at the same time, having chats together in Slack, having video calls, having pairing, having meetings together. So much of our communication is not asynchronous. It's not piece of writing up here, piece and reading, piece of writing there. It's very much about chatting in channels and stuff like that. And of course, we work really hard to make sure that notifications aren't so heavy, such that that becomes an attention thing. There's a lot of really good things that Basecamp has noticed in terms of the fact that when it's the constant knock on your office door, you can't ever get anything done. So one of the things we try to do is we try to create space for there to be consumable collaboration spaces where you can go do it, but the amount of forced notifications on you is still very low. And so we're trying to go the balance between Basecamp's like total disconnect and asynchronicity and the traditional work environment where you're interrupted all the time. And we're programmers, and programmers hate being interrupted, where you're interrupted all the time and things are pinging up everywhere. There's notifications, there's new emails all the time. So Slack, trying to create kind of interaction times and spaces that would be in a normal office. You need to work harder for those things in remote than you do elsewhere. And so that's why we've done these different experiments. We do monthly lunch and learns. We do on-site once a year, and then also we bring the whole company to Laracon every year. Again, more of that kind of physical connection and being in the same space and actually getting to know each other personally. Or physically being in the same space. There's certainly pitfalls. One of the pitfalls is isolation, for sure. We've actually had at least one person leave saying, "I love Titan, I think you're great, but I want to work with people in physical proximity." And that's a personal thing that has nothing to do with us doing it right or them being wrong or anything. It's purely just about, they said, you know what, it's just not for me, and that's a totally valid thing. Other pitfalls, I think that you could see this as a pitfall, actually see it as an upside, but the trust relationship required between employees and employers is much higher. And that's how we like to work. Trust is like one of our most frequently used words, trust and integrity. And we love being in a place where we need to believe that people will do their work well, and we don't have to think about it. That doesn't mean that there's no accountability whatsoever, but it definitely is a point where we don't sit around and feel like we need to be like watching people's screens or something like that. So that's another pitfall. Let me think about other pitfalls about being remote. The more remote you get, the more pitfalls you have. That's one of the reasons why we have only employees right now from North America, but our general idea is people who are willing to overlap with the continental US time zones. So basically Pacific, Mountain, Central, and Eastern. So we're toying around with the idea of considering people who are not in North and South America, but willing to work those time zones. We haven't done it yet, in part because as soon as you're outside of the U.S., payments and legal situations are more complicated to deal with. But even in the U.S., it's complicated because for every single state we hire somebody from, we have to do this whole big legal hullabaloo that we wouldn't if they lived in the same place as us. And everyone knows the benefits of remote, right? I don't need to talk about the values that we get from it. So I'm trying to think about any of the other, and Jonas asked about pitfalls, any of the other downsides or difficult things that we've had to think about. So if somebody were to live far away, we would have to talk about the cost of flying them to on-sites and the cost of flying them to Laracon, but that could be a part of the hiring process. In theory, if somebody lived in a totally different country and we could work out the cost of flying them to on-sites and they just, whatever their life worked out, they worked the same hours as the rest of us, assuming we could get all the taxes and payment situations worked out, that wouldn't be a big concern for us because we've already had Titan employees who say, hey, I'm going to spend 3 or 4 weeks in Europe and just work American hours, Eastern hours, whatever. And go, okay, cool. Like that doesn't mean that we don't have to figure things out. Like sometimes they get there and the internet is not as consistent as they thought. And that's something that we really need to have. You got to have consistent internet. So there are some things. But I feel like there are less pitfalls than you might think. There's work. We have to be thoughtful and we have to be cognizant of the costs that come from there. But I think that those costs were there the day we had our first employee. And of course, if you're adding employees, you're adding remote employees to an existing non-remote situation, then you have a ton of potential pitfalls, about having those people feeling like they're second-class citizens. And quite a few people have talked and written about the idea that in that context, you need to make your whole company remote, even if they're in the same physical space. So basically prioritize communication forms that might seem silly because you're communicating with someone right next to you for the sake of that person who's not right next to you. So there's things to think about there. But yeah, pitfalls. I mean, I think that pitfalls for the individual primarily have to do with just connection, human interaction. And it'd be better to ask people, not me, about that probably, in part because I've got a family that I see all the time, every day for hours a day. Plus I go out of the office to a co-working space. So I have interactions with people in the hallway and stuff like that. And we encourage people to do that. More than half of the company works from home and doesn't have that. But we have regular conversations with people about, hey, maybe consider a co-working space or a coffee shop a couple days a week just to see people. So I would say that isolation is probably the top one that is still a present thing. And yeah, we have costs, but they're more organizational. I don't think that there's a ton of really significant personal costs. So I hope that helps. I hope that's good. Keep these questions coming. I really enjoy talking about this stuff. I really appreciate the responses I've gotten from everyone. And if you have questions, leave them in the comments or hit me up on Twitter @StaufferMatt. All right, see you next time.